Welcome to Caledonia Sleeps, your peaceful escape into the heart of Scotland. The fire burns low tonight. Outside, winter presses its face against the glass, and the wind carries with it the old stories, the ones that refuse to be forgotten. Beyond the glow of these embers lies a darkness Scotland carried for nearly 2 centuries, a darkness born not of witches, but of fear itself. Tonight, we gather by the hearth not to frighten, but to remember, to honour those who suffered, to understand how entire communities turned on their neighbours, mothers, healers and grandmothers, and to witness how one of history's cruelest chapters finally came to its end. Between 1563 and 1736, Scotland was gripped by witch trials that saw between 4,000 and 6,000 people accused. Approximately 2/3 were executed, strangled and burned, their lives reduced to ash and accusation. Most were women, most were innocent, all deserve to be remembered. In 2022, Scotland's First Minister offered a formal apology, calling it injustice on a colossal scale. The Church of Scotland acknowledged the terrible harm. These were not monsters, but neighbours, not villains, but victims. So let us begin this journey with reverence. Let the fire's warmth remind us that even in the coldest chapters of history, there is always light to be found in remembrance, in truth, and in the courage to face what was done in our ancestors' names. In 1560, Scotland's Parliament made a choice that would reshape the nation's soul. Under the fierce guidance of John Knox, Protestantism became the official religion, and with it came a new vision of what Scotland should be, a godly state, pure and watchful, where sin could not hide. The Kirk, Scotland's Protestant church, began to look closely at the lives of the ordinary people. Were they attending services? Were they living righteously? Were there whispers of practices that might invite the devil's attention? The old Catholic tolerance for folk customs, charms worn for protection, herbs gathered by moonlight, began to erode like coastal cliffs beneath relentless waves. The belief took hold that tolerating evil among the population would bring God's wrath upon the entire community. If a witch lived in your village, her presence alone might curse the harvest, sicken the livestock, bring plague to your children. The community's survival depended on rooting out malevolence wherever it hid. It was in this climate of fear and religious fervour that Parliament passed the Witchcraft Act of 1563. The Act was brief and absolute. Witchcraft, or even consulting with witches, became a capital crime. The penalty was death, no exceptions, no mercy. Before this law, there had been scattered prosecutions for harm done through magic, cases where someone claimed injury from a curse or spell. But the 1563 Act transformed everything. Now, the mere practice of witchcraft, whether harm was proven or not, whether anyone complained or not, was enough to warrant execution. King James VI, who would later become James I of England, played a central role in this transformation. His obsession with witchcraft would fuel Scotland's trials for generations. Walk through the records and a pattern emerges, stark as frost on glass. 75% of the accused were women. Most lived in the lowlands, particularly in the Lothians, where 32% of all named witches resided. East Lothian saw the fiercest hunting. The typical victim, an old woman, often a widow or spinster, someone who lived alone or on the margins of the community. Healers and midwives, women who knew herbs and could ease the pain of childbirth, were especially vulnerable. Their knowledge of the body, their proximity to birth and death, made them suspect. A baby born healthy was a blessing. A baby born dead meant questions, whispers, and sometimes accusations. But it was not only women. Men too stood trial, particularly if they were healers, outsiders, or possessed knowledge that seemed uncanny. John Fian, a schoolmaster, Thomas Weir, a soldier. Their gender offered little protection when suspicion turned its eye upon them. Why were women targeted so fiercely? The beliefs of the time held that women were weaker-willed, more easily tempted by the devil. Their bodies, their emotions, their very nature was seen as closer to sin. Independence in a woman, living without a husband's authority, practicing skills that gave her power over life and death, these became dangerous qualities. The accused were often the vulnerable, the poor, the elderly, those who had quarrelled with neighbours, those whose behaviour seemed strange or whose circumstances invited scrutiny. In a world without medical explanations for sudden illness, without scientific understanding of weather or crop failure, someone had to be blamed, and the blame fell heaviest on those with the least power to defend themselves. The year was 1589, and King James VI of Scotland set sail for Denmark to collect his bride Anne, daughter of King Frederick II. It should have been a journey of joy, a royal wedding voyage blessed by fair winds and calm seas. Instead, the North Sea rose up in fury. Storms battered the fleet with a violence that terrified even seasonal sailors. Waves tall as church steeples crashed over the decks. The wind shrieked through the rigging like a living thing, howling its rage. James's ship was tossed and beaten, driven back towards shore again and again. Finally, battered and humiliated, The fleet limped into harbour in Norway, forced to wait weeks before conditions improved enough to continue. While sheltering in Norway, James met with Niels Hemmingsen, a Danish Lutheran, theologian, and expert on demonology. Hemmingsen spoke of witches, of their power to raise storms, of their pacts with Satan himself. And when the Danish admiral declared that the tempest had been no natural weather, but witchcraft, specifically caused by women who had been offended, James believed him. Witch hunts erupted simultaneously in Denmark and Scotland. In Denmark, a woman named Anna Coldings was burned at the stake at Kronborg, along with 12 others. They confessed under torture to conjuring the storms that had threatened the royal voyage. In Scotland, the hunt began with a young woman named Geillis Duncan. Imagine her, a young woman, though her exact age is unrecorded, working as a maidservant in the household of David Seaton, the deputy bailiff of Tranent. Her hands knew the weight of buckets, the heat of cook fires, the endless small labours that kept a household running. But Geillis had a gift. She could heal. People came to her with aches and fevers, and often after her ministrations with herbs and gentle words, they improved. Word spread. Too many people came. Too many recoveries happened under her care. Her employer, David Seaton, grew suspicious. In Protestant Scotland, such miraculous healing raised questions. How could a simple serving girl possess such abilities unless she had help from something unholy? What happened next is documented. Seaton, using his legal authority as deputy bailiff, interrogated her. She denied any wrongdoing, insisting she was only trying to help, only using knowledge of plants and healing passed down to her. But Seaton was not satisfied. The torture began. Historical sources document that he used pillywinks, crushing instruments for the fingers, and rope torture, winding cord around her head and twisting it tight. Still she denied it. Still she insisted she was innocent. Then they searched her body for the devil's mark. Every birthmark, every mole, every small imperfection was examined, poked, prodded. When they found a mark on her neck, a small discoloration she had carried since childhood, they proclaimed it as evidence. The devil had marked her as his own. After days without sleep, without food, with pain her only companion, Geillis Duncan broke. She confessed. Yes, she had met with the devil. Yes, she had attended gatherings with other witches. Yes, she had helped raise the storm that threatened the king's ship. And she named others. Agnes Sampson, the respected midwife, John Fian, the schoolmaster, Euphemia McCallion, a gentlewoman. The names spilled from her like water from a cracked jug, each one condemning another soul to the same fate she now faced. Geillis Duncan was eventually executed in December 1591, strangled and burned for her alleged crimes. The North Berwick Witch Trials had begun. Agnes Sampson was known throughout Haddington and beyond as the wise wife of Keith. For decades she had served her community as a midwife and healer. When a woman cried out in labour, Agnes was the one called. When a child burned with fever, Agnes knew which herbs would bring the temperature down. When an elderly man suffered with joints that ached like broken glass, Agnes made poultices that soothed the pain. She had a particular gift, or so people believed. Witnesses claimed she could take on her patient's suffering. She would kneel beside a sick bed, place her hands upon the afflicted person and pray. Those who watched swore she prayed for the pain to leave them and enter her instead, and that sometimes it seemed to work. The patient would ease, would sleep, would heal, while Agnes appeared to bear the weight of their illness until she could banish it through prayer and strength of will. Whether this was genuine transference of suffering, the power of belief, or simply the natural course of illness and recovery, her neighbours interpreted it as a remarkable healing ability. This was the woman they arrested on charges of witchcraft. They brought her to Edinburgh in chains. The date was late in 1590. The city cold with approaching winter. She was taken to a cell, and there the interrogation began. She denied everything. She was a Christian woman, she said. She had only ever tried to help. The charms she used were prayers. The herbs were God's creation, given to ease suffering. She had done nothing wrong. King James himself became involved. He attended her interrogation, watching from the shadows as his officials questioned her. But Agnes held firm in her denials, and James grew frustrated. This woman, this aging midwife, dared to contradict the narrative he needed to hear. The torture intensified. They shaved her head completely, every hair removed, until her scalp gleamed pale and vulnerable. They shaved her entire body, searching for the devil's mark, examining every inch of her aging skin with cold, methodical cruelty. When they found what they deemed a privy mark in an intimate place, they declared it proof of her guilt. Still, she denied it. Then, according to contemporary accounts, came the scold's bridle, an iron contraption fitted around her head, with sharp prongs forced into her mouth to prevent speech. The pamphlet News from Scotland describes how she was fastened to the wall of her cell by this device, though the exact mechanics of her restraint may have been embellished in the retelling. What is certain is that she was deprived of sleep, kept awake for days on end. A rope was wound around her head and twisted tight, a torture method well documented in Scottish trials. The combination of sleep deprivation, physical pain, and psychological pressure eventually broke even the strongest will. Finally, After 53 separate charges and torture that went on for weeks, Agnes Sampson confessed. Under this duress, she told them what they wanted to hear. She confessed to attending a witch's Sabbath on Halloween night at the kirk in North Berwick, claiming 200 witches had been present. She described how they had danced and sung until the devil appeared, and how he had commanded them to kiss his buttocks in sign of their allegiance. She confessed to plotting to kill the king by raising storms at sea. These confessions bore all the hallmarks of interrogation under torture, with details that matched what her interrogators expected witches to do, drawn from demonological texts and popular belief rather than genuine practice. But even King James was sceptical. These confessions seemed too fantastical, too much like the fever dreams of a tortured mind. He decided to test her. He brought Agnes before him privately and demanded proof. If she truly had power from Satan, she would know things no earthly person could know. What happened next became one of the trial's most famous moments, though we must rely on the account in News from Scotland, a pamphlet published in 1591 that may have dramatised events for its readers. According to this source, Agnes told him details of his wedding night with Anne, intimate conversations between husband and wife that took place in their chambers in Oslo. The pamphlet claims she described words spoken in privacy that no servant could have overheard, no spy could have reported. Whether Agnes truly possessed such knowledge, or whether the story was embellished to make the king's belief more understandable, James became convinced. This woman had supernatural knowledge, he concluded. She must be a witch. On January the 27th, 1591, Agnes Sampson was found guilty. The next day, January the 28th, she was taken to Castle Hill in Edinburgh. Records indicate she was executed by strangling and burning, the standard punishment for convicted witches. While most condemned witches were strangled before the fire was lit, a mercy that brought death before the flames did their work, the exact details of Agnes's final moments have not survived in clear documentation. What is certain is that her life ended in smoke and fire, and with it, decades of healing, kindness, and service to her community were reduced to ash and horrified memory. John Fian, the schoolmaster of salt pans, endured severe torture before his execution. Historical records document that he suffered the pillywinks, which crushed his fingers, and the boots, which broke his legs. These methods were designed to extract confession through unbearable pain. He was burned at the stake on Castle Hill in late December 1590 or early January 1591, depending on which calendar system the sources use. Euphemia McCallion, a woman of wealth and status, could not buy her way out of accusation. She was charged with petty treason, not just against the king, but against her own husband, her lawful sovereign as a married woman. The punishment for petty treason was even more brutal. She was burned alive, not strangled first, the flames consuming her while she still drew her breath. Barbara Napier, found guilty of lesser charges, should have escaped with banishment or imprisonment, but King James wanted her dead and personally intervened, demanding harsher punishment. She bought time through pregnancy, but the king's fury did not abate. Over 2 years, the North Berwick Trials consumed East Lothian. Somewhere between 70 and 200 people were tried, the exact number lost to time and incomplete records. The trials established a pattern that would repeat for decades: torture, forced confession, execution, and the naming of accomplices that spread the accusations like contagion through entire communities. King James wrote his treatise, Demonology, in 1597, a defence of witch hunting that would influence trials not only in Scotland but across Europe and eventually in the American colonies. The North Berwick Trials made him believe in the reality of witchcraft, and his belief gave legitimacy to persecution. Years later, when William Shakespeare wrote Macbeth for King James's court, he included witches who sailed in sieves and conjured storms. The play was not fantasy, but a reflection of events the king himself had witnessed and promoted, a reminder that art and terror often walk hand in hand. Between the first trials in 1590 and the final execution in 1727, Scotland experienced 5 major waves of witch hunting, periods when accusations surged and executions multiplied. Each wave had its own character, its own triggers, but all shared common threads: social instability, religious fervour, and the desperate human need to blame someone when the world fell apart. The Great Scottish Witch Hunt of 1597 remains the least documented of the 5 nationwide panics, but what records survive paint a grim picture. At least 400 people stood trial. Approximately 200 were executed. The wave began in March, in Slains north of Aberdeen, where local authorities sought permission to execute witches already in custody. From there, it spread like fire through dry heather, consuming village after village. King James, now thoroughly convinced of the witchcraft threat, threw himself into investigations. He spent 9 days at St Andrews in July, personally attending trials, questioning the accused, seeking proof of diabolical pacts. The defining figure of 1597's panic was Margaret Aitken, called the Great Witch of Balwearie. Arrested in Fife in April, she confessed under torture and then made a desperate bargain: her life in exchange for identifying other witches. For 4 months, Margaret travelled Scotland under guard, pointing out witches in town after town. Her finger became a sentence of death. When she identified someone as a witch, they were arrested, tried, often executed, the commissions trusted her completely, until one day Margaret made a mistake. When shown the same people a second time, people she had previously condemned as witches, she declared them innocent. When shown them again later, she identified them as witches once more. Her inconsistency was finally noticed. On August 12, 1597, King James ordered the commissions halted. Margaret Aitken's credibility collapsed, but the damage was done. Hundreds had been accused on her word alone. How many innocents had died because of her desperate lies? The English ambassador wrote on August the 15th, "The king hath been lately pestered, and in many ways troubled in the examination of the witches, which swarm in exceeding number, and as is credibly reported, in many thousands. In a country with a population far smaller than England's, the scale of accusation was staggering." The trials followed a predictable, terrible pattern. It often began with misfortune. A cow's milk turned sour. A child fell ill with mysterious fits. Crops failed despite careful tending. Someone had to be blamed, and suspicion fell on those already marked as different. The old woman who muttered to herself, the widow who lived alone, the healer whose remedies sometimes failed. A quarrel might spark it, an angry word, a perceived slight, and suddenly the neighbour who had seemed odd became the neighbour accused of cursing your family. The accusation would be brought before the Kirk session, the local church authorities, who would investigate. If the Kirk found the accusations credible, they would seek a commission from the Privy Council in Edinburgh, permission to hold a trial. Most trials took place in local courts, presided over by local magistrates who knew the accused, who had their own opinions, their own grudges, their own fears. Evidence came in two forms. First, there was the testimony from neighbours, recounting quarrels, strange incidents, unexplained misfortunes. These testimonies often revealed long-simmering community tensions, jealousies, and resentments given deadly expression through witchcraft accusations. Second, there was a confession of the accused, almost always obtained through torture. Sleep deprivation was the most common method, and perhaps, in a way, the cruelest. The accused would be kept awake for days, sometimes a week or more, shaken and poked and shouted at every time they tried to close their eyes. Hallucinations set in, reality fractured. Eventually, they would confess to anything, say anything, just to be allowed to sleep. Pricking was both torture and investigation. Professional witch prickers travelled Scotland, offering their services for a fee. They would strip the accused naked and search every inch of their body for the devil's mark, any spot that wouldn't bleed or feel pain when pierced with a long pin. Birthmarks, moles, scars, even calluses were pricked again and again Some prickers used retractable pins that appeared to sink into the flesh, but didn't actually pierce the skin at all, guaranteeing they would find evidence in every case. The pillywinks crushed fingers between iron bars. The boots crushed legs and feet. The branks, or scold's bridle, were used to silence women who protested too loudly. Rope torture, head shaving, public humiliation, all were deployed to break the will and extract confession. And confession was essential. Under Scottish law, a confession, combined with other evidence, was enough to convict. Once someone confessed, they were asked to name their accomplices, their fellow witches. Every name given meant another person arrested, another trial, another round of torture. The web of accusation spread. The concept of the Devil's Pact was central to Scottish witch beliefs. The accused would be asked, "When did you meet the devil? What did he look like? What did he promise you? Where did you sign your name in his book? Did you re-announce your baptism? Did you give yourself to him body and soul?" Some confessed to flying to Sabbaths, great gatherings of witches, where they danced with the devil and plotted harm. Others confessed to shape-shifting, turning into hares or cats. Still others confessed to making wax dolls in the likeness of their victims, then melting them in fire or piercing them with pins, believing this would cause illness and death. How much of these confessions reflected genuine folk beliefs, and how much was fantasy created by the interaction between terrified prisoners and interrogators with preconceived notions of what witches did? Scholars still debate this question. What is certain is that torture produces unreliable testimony, that people will confess to impossible things if the pain becomes unbearable. But there was one woman whose confessions stand apart from all the others, not because they were extracted through brutal torture, but because she offered them freely, in extraordinary detail, over 6 weeks in the spring of 1662. Her name was Isobel Gowdie, and she lived near Aldern in the Highlands, a small settlement a few miles east of Nairn. She was married to John Gilbert, a farm labourer, a cotter who worked the land in exchange for a modest cottage and a patch of ground. Isobel could neither read nor write, yet she possessed a remarkable imagination and an eloquent tongue. On April 13th, 1662, Isobel came forward to the local authorities. No one had accused her. No neighbour had pointed a finger. No misfortune had been blamed on her. She simply appeared before the ministers and lairds of Aldern and began to confess. What followed was extraordinary. Over 4 separate interrogations spanning 6 weeks, Isobel told stories that have captivated scholars ever since. She described meeting the devil in the kirkyard at Aldern, where he had marked her shoulder and sucked blood from it as a sign of their pact. She claimed membership in a coven of 13 witches who gathered regularly for Sabbaths, dancing and feasting in service to their dark master. But Isobel's confessions went far beyond the standard accusations. She recited 27 different charms and transformation spells, more than in any other British witchcraft case. She gave detailed instructions for shape-shifting into animals, complete with rhyming incantations. She described visits to Elfland, to the court of the Queen of the Fairies beneath the green hills, where she feasted on food that never diminished and learned magical arts. She named the fairies she met, some with whimsical names, others with darker titles. She spoke of flying through the night on enchanted steeds, of casting spells to harm crops and livestock, of creating elf arrows that could kill at a distance. The notary, John Innes, could barely keep pace with her words. He wrote frantically, adding etc. at points where he simply couldn't capture everything she said. Her confessions were recorded in the first person, preserving her voice with an immediacy rare in trial documents. Why did Isobel confess? Scholars have debated this for centuries. Some suggest she suffered from a psychological condition, perhaps what we would now recognise as a dissociative disorder or psychosis. Others have proposed ergot poisoning, a hallucinogenic mould that grows on rye. Rye was grown in Nairn during this period, and Isobel mentioned it in her confessions, making this theory at least plausible. Still, others argue that Isobel was a genuine folk practitioner, someone who knew the old charms and stories, the transformation magic and fairy lore that had survived from pre-Christian times. Her confessions in this reading preserve authentic folk beliefs, though filtered through the lens of Christian demonology that the interrogators expected. Or perhaps she was simply a storyteller, a woman with a gift for narrative who found herself in solitary confinement with an audience that hung on her every word. Some scholars note that her confessions grew more elaborate with each interrogation, especially as crowds began to gather to hear her speak. She may have been performing, creating an epic tale that would be remembered. Whatever her motivations, Isobel named others, implicating more than 40 people. After 6 weeks, the authorities sought permission for a local trial. There is no record of her execution, though most historians believe she was strangled and burned in mid-July 1662. Isobel Gowdie left behind one of the most comprehensive records of witchcraft folklore ever documented. Composer James Macmillan honoured her memory with an orchestral work in 1990. She remains a mystery, a woman who spoke when silence might have saved her, who wove together fairy tales and demonology, folk magic and Christian hearsay, into confessions so detailed and strange that we are still trying to understand them more than 350 years later. By 1697, the great waves of witch hunting had mostly passed. The fever that gripped Scotland in the 1590s and 1660s had cooled. Educated opinion was turning sceptical. Courts were less willing to accept spectral evidence, claims of invisible spirits and dream visions. But in the small town of Paisley, the old fears had not died. Christian Shaw was 11 years old, the daughter of the Laird of Bargarin, when her world and her body turned strange. It began with a simple incident. She caught Catherine Campbell, a young Highland woman, working as a servant in the household, stealing a drink of milk. Christian, dutiful daughter, told her mother. Catherine was scolded, and in her anger and humiliation, she cursed the child. The exact words vary in retellings, but the essence remains. Catherine called on God and devil both to torment Christian Shaw, to drag her soul through hell itself. Within hours, Christian fell ill. What witnesses describe were dramatic fits. She would suddenly go rigid, her body contorting in ways that alarmed those watching. She spoke in what seemed like different voices. She claimed invisible hands pinched and scratched her, that unseen forces carried her through the air. Most remarkably, observers reported that she vomited up objects, pins, hair, feathers, small stones, bits that appeared to be animal bone. These were interpreted as witches' tokens, proof that the supernatural malevolence was at work. Modern scholars have suggested various explanations for such symptoms, from psychological disorders to deliberate deception. But in 1696, the conclusion seemed clear to those present: demonic possession. Her family called doctors. Matthew Brisbane, the most skilled physician in Glasgow, examined her and could find no natural cause. Minister James Brisbane attended her and declared it a clear case of demonic possession. The family prayed, fasted, and sought divine intervention, but Christian's torments continued. After 2 months of this, Christian named her tormentors: Catherine Campbell, who had cursed her; Agnes Naismith, an older woman with a reputation for cunning; and more names. Eventually 35 people, most of them women, most of them poor. The Scottish Privy Council set up a commission to investigate, with Lord Blantyre presiding. It was February 1697, winter in Scotland, the kind of cold that seeps into bones and breeds despair. The accused were questioned, examined for witch marks, and held in brutal conditions. Many wealthy families quietly paid bribes or offered land to have their relatives removed from the accusation list. By the time the actual trial began, only 7 remained, those whose families had no power, no wealth, no influence to save them. 7 souls, condemned by their poverty as much as by any evidence. Catherine Campbell, the young Highland woman, Margaret Lang, John Lindsay and James Lindsay, brothers, Catherine Campbell, a different woman with the same name, or perhaps confused in the records, Margaret Fulton, Agnes Naismith. During the trial, Minister James Hutchison delivered a sermon that sealed their fate. He told the jury, in language as stark as winter frost, that if they acquitted these people, the jury members themselves would be accessory to all the blasphemies, apostasies, murders, tortures, and seductions that these witches would commit once freed. Under such pressure, with such threats, the verdict was inevitable. Guilty, all 7. The morning of June the 10th, 1697, dawned grey over Paisley. The 7 condemned were brought from the Tolbooth and paraded slowly through the streets towards the Gallow Green, a public execution ground at the west end of town. Catherine Campbell fought. Multiple accounts describe how she struggled and cried out as they brought her towards the gallows, calling down curses on those who had condemned her. Her resistance and her final words became part of the trial's enduring memory. Margaret Fulton appeared to have lost touch with reality. Sources describe her speaking of visits to Elfland and riding with fairy folk. Whether this was genuine mental disturbance, a coping mechanism in the face of death, or part of her confession under interrogation that she continued to believe, she seemed disconnected from the horror of her situation. The 2 Lindsay brothers, John and James, held hands as they approached the gallows. Some sources describe them as young, though their exact ages are disputed in historical records. They were hanged together, offering each other what comfort they could in their final moments. All 7 were hanged, strangled by the rope until death released them. Then their bodies were burned, reduced to ash and bone, the remains buried at a crossroad with a horseshoe placed on top. The horseshoe was meant to trap their spirits, to prevent them from rising and taking revenge on the living. For years afterward, every tragedy in Paisley was blamed on Agnes Naismith's curse, her final words calling down misfortune on the town and everyone in it. Christian Shaw recovered. Her fits ceased. She grew up, married the Reverend John Miller, was widowed young, and became a successful businesswoman. She founded Paisley's thread industry, her Bergarin trademark thread eventually making the town famous. The industry she started would employ thousands, would shape Paisley's history for centuries. She was sponsored and supported by Lady Blantyre, wife of the man who had presided over the Witch Trial Commission. The irony is sharp enough to cut. Did Christian believe she had been bewitched? Did she feel guilt later? Or had she convinced herself so thoroughly of the witch's reality that she lived without remorse? We will never fully know. History is silent on her inner life, recording only her outer success. But the 7 who died had no such silence. Their names are remembered. Their deaths mark the last mass execution for witchcraft in Western Europe, the final great flare of a dying horror before the light of reason finally began to dawn. 7 years after Paisley, in the coastal village of Torryburn in Fife, an elderly woman, became one of the final victims of Scotland's witch trials. Her story is unique because, unlike most victims who were burned to ash and left no trace, Lilias Adie has a grave that remains to this day. Lilias Adie was in her 60s, living quietly in Torryburn, when illness swept through the village in the summer of 1704. On a July evening, a woman named Jean Bizet, appearing drunk or disturbed, began making accusations toward Lilias. She cried out that Lilias was coming for her and her child, calling on God and invoking Lilias by name in her distress. On July 28th, 1704, Lilias was arrested and imprisoned. For a month she endured interrogation, sleep deprivation, and pricking tests to find the devil's mark. On August 29th, exhausted and broken, she confessed to meeting the devil in a cornfield, to renouncing her baptism, to attending witches' gatherings. But when pressed to name her accomplices, Lilias refused. Despite the pressure, she would not give up other names. She told her interrogators the other witches wore masks and she couldn't identify them. Whether this was protection for her neighbours or clever evasion, she saved lives by her silence. That same day, August 29th, 1704, Lilias died in prison. She never stood trial, was never formally convicted. Most historians believe she took her own life, unable to face the torture and execution that awaited her. Lilias's death created a dilemma. She had confessed but never been convicted. The authorities could not bury her in the kirkyard alongside the godly, yet they feared her spirit might rise from the grave, animated by the devil. So they buried her on the beach at Torryburn Bay, between the high and low tide marks. The constant movement of the water, they believed, would trap her spirit. They placed her in a simple wooden coffin and covered it with an enormous stone slab. This intertidal burial, called a revenant burial, was Scotland's only known such burial of an accused witch. For a century and a half, Lilias rested beneath her stone, but in 1852, grave robbers exhumed her remains, selling her skull and bones to collectors interested in phrenology. In 1904, her skull was photographed. After that, the bones disappeared and have never been found. In 2014, historians relocated her burial site using old documents. The rectangular stone slab still sits on the beach near Torryburn Railway Bridge, covered in seaweed, with the remains of the iron ring visible. In 2017, forensic artist Dr. Christopher Wren used the 1904 photographs to reconstruct Lilias' face, the first time anyone had seen the face of a Scottish witch trial victim. The reconstruction shows an ordinary older woman, someone who looks like a neighbour, a grandmother. On August 31st, 2019, exactly 315 years after Lilias died, a memorial service was held at Torryburn. A small memorial coin near the site reads, Lilias Adie, 1640 to 1704. They feared she would rise from the dead. How could she, as she was an ordinary woman accused? Lilias Adie's grave remains today, lapped by the tides of the Firth of Forth, a tangible reminder that the victims of Scotland's witch trials were not monsters, but ordinary people caught in extraordinary times. In the far north of Scotland, in the country of Sutherland, sits the small town of Dornoch. It is a peaceful place now, known for its golf course and its pale beaches where seals bask on sunny days. But in 1727, Dornoch became the site of Scotland's final witch execution. Her name, records tell us, was Janet Horne, though even that is uncertain. Janet Horne, or Jenny Horne, was a generic term for witches in northern Scotland, a name used the same way we might say Jane Doe for an unknown woman. Her real name, her real identity, may have been lost to time, or perhaps deliberately obscured in a region where no one wanted to remember too clearly. What we know is this: she was elderly. She showed signs of what we would now recognise as senile dementia. She lived with her daughter, who had a deformity of her hands and feet, possibly a condition that ran in families, a physical difference that cruel neighbours chose to interpret as evidence of witchcraft. They said she had turned her daughter into a pony, that she rode her to meetings with the devil, where Satan himself shod the poor girl with horseshoes of iron. The daughter's deformed feet and hands, they claimed, were proof, hoof-like evidence of this transformation. They said she bewitched pigs and poultry, causing them to sicken and die. In a community where livestock meant survival, where a lost pig might mean a winter of hunger, such accusations carried weight. Janet and her daughter were arrested and brought before Captain David Ross, the Sheriff Depute of Sutherland. The trial was quick, perfunctory, and of questionable legality. By 1727, the great witch-hunting period was over. Central courts had ceased to convict. Educated opinion had turned against the trials, but in this remote corner of Scotland, the old fears persisted. Ross exceeded his authority in judging the case. He should have referred it to higher courts, but he did not. He pronounced both women guilty and sentenced them to death. The daughter managed to escape. How she did so, whether helped by sympathetic guards or simply overlooked in the confusion of preparations, we do not know. But she fled, and no record tells us what became of her. Janet was not so fortunate. They stripped her naked on a cold June morning. They smeared her elderly body with tar, thick and sticky and foul-smelling. They covered her with feathers until she looked like some grotesque bird. Then they sat her on a barrow and paraded her through the streets of Dornoch, a public humiliation designed to warn others against witchcraft. The fire was built at Littletown, just outside the main settlement. A crowd gathered to watch. This was the last act in a long drama of fear and cruelty that had played across Scotland for nearly 2 centuries. And here, the most heartbreaking detail, preserved in oral tradition and later written accounts. Janet, her mind clouded by what appeared to be dementia, seemed not to understand what was happening. According to the traditional telling, when she saw the fire being prepared, she reached out her hands toward the flames, speaking of the bonny fire. Later accounts record her as having said something like, "I've tried to lead a good life, but my people are strangers to me now." Whether these were her actual words or part of the oral tradition that grew around the story, they capture the tragedy of an elderly, confused woman caught in a system that showed no mercy. Most accused witches were strangled before burning, a small mercy to spare them the agony of the flames. According to most accounts of Janet Horne's execution, she was burned alive, though the lack of official records means we cannot be entirely certain of the exact method. What is documented is that she was executed in 1727, making her the last person legally executed for witchcraft in Britain. The Witch's Stone stands in Littletown to this day, marking the spot. It bears the date 1722, which is incorrect. The execution was in 1727. The error has never been corrected. A small confusion in the memorial to a great injustice. 9 years after Janet's death in 1736, the British Parliament repealed the Witchcraft Act. Witch trials became illegal throughout Britain. The age of witch hunting was finally, officially over. Janet Horne was the last legal execution for witchcraft in all of Britain, the final victim of a madness that had consumed thousands. Why did Scotland hunt witches with such ferocity? Why did these trials happen here, in this particular time and place? Historians have debated these questions for decades, and the answer is complex, woven from many threads. There was no single cause. Rather, there were what scholars call associated circumstances, multiple factors that combined to create the perfect conditions for mass persecution. The Protestant Reformation fractured Christian Europe. Catholics and Protestants accused each other of heresy, of being in league with the devil. Each side needed to prove its godliness, its righteousness, its favour in God's eyes. In Scotland, the new Protestant Kirk was especially concerned with moral purity. The Kirk sessions, local church courts, began regulating behaviour in unprecedented ways. They monitored who attended services, who took communion properly, who committed sexual sins, who quarrelled or drank or failed to observe the Sabbath. Witchcraft fit naturally into this framework of moral surveillance. If you could be punished for missing church, how much more deserving of punishment was someone who had renounced God entirely and given themselves to Satan. Scotland in the 16th and 17th centuries faced repeated crisis. Harvests failed, plague came in waves, wars with England drained resources. People were hungry, frightened, desperate for explanations. When the weather turned harsh and crops rotted in the fields, someone had to be blamed. When disease swept through a village and children died, someone had to be responsible. Witches provided an answer, a reason why bad things happened to good people. It was not random chance or God's inscrutable will. It was malevolent neighbours wielding dark powers. Economic competition between women played a role too. Midwifery and healing were some of the few ways women could earn money and gain status. When male physicians and surgeons began to professionalise medicine, they saw cunning women and traditional healers as competition. Accusations of witchcraft could conveniently remove rivals from the field. Scotland's inquisitorial legal system differed significantly from England's. Scottish courts used torture legally, while English courts officially did not. This made obtaining confessions easier and the confessions more elaborate. Scottish justice was also highly decentralised. Local courts, presided over by local magistrates, heard most witch cases. These magistrates knew the accused, knew the community tensions, and were subject to local pressures in ways that distant circuit judges were not. Interestingly, Scottish courts did allow the accused to have defence lawyers, which England did not. This led to higher acquittal rates in some areas, but it did not prevent the thousands of executions. Women made up 3/4 of the accused. This was not accidental. Early modern Europe held deeply misogynistic beliefs. Women were weaker-willed than men, more easily tempted, more emotional, and therefore less rational, more tied to their bodies and therefore more susceptible to bodily sins. Women who lived outside male control, widows and spinsters especially, were seen as dangerous. Women whose work involved life and death, midwives and healers, seemed to possess uncanny powers. Women who were poor and dependent on charity were seen as potentially resentful and therefore likely to curse the betters. Witchcraft accusations often targeted women who violated social norms in some way. The woman who talked back, the woman who refused to be subservient, the woman who was too successful, the woman who was too knowledgeable. England had witch trials too, but far fewer per capita than Scotland. Why the difference? The Kirk's involvement in Scotland was deeper than the Church of England's involvement. Scottish ministers actively participated in investigations and trials. They preached about witchcraft. They identified suspects. They testified against the accused. The concept of the diabolic pact was more central in Scotland. In England, witchcraft was often prosecuted as harmful magic, maleficium. focusing on the damage done. In Scotland, the focus shifted to the relationship with the devil himself, making it a form of treason against God and King. King James VI's personal involvement in his book Demonology gave official sanction and intellectual legitimacy to witch hunting in a way that England never quite matched. If these trials were driven by such powerful forces, religious fervour, social tension, legal precedent, gendered fear, why did they end? The answer lies in a gradual shift in thinking, a slow dawn of scepticism that eventually became bright enough to banish the shadows. By the late 17th century, educated opinion began to question the trials. Philosophers and scientists were developing new ways of understanding the world, ways based on observation and reason rather than superstition and fear. Lord Advocate George Mackenzie, one of Scotland's most prominent legal figures, worked to make witch prosecutions ineffective. He questioned the reliability of evidence obtained through torture, pointed out the contradictions in confessions, and made it harder for local courts to secure convictions. The infamous witch prickers were exposed as frauds. One operating under the name Mr. Paterson was discovered to be a woman disguised in men's clothing, using retractable pins to guarantee finding the devil's mark on every victim. When this was revealed, it cast doubt on the entire practice of pricking. Spectral evidence, testimony about dreams and visions and invisible spirits came under scrutiny. How could courts convict based on things only the accuser could see? How could the accused defend themselves against charges of spiritual crimes that left no physical evidence? As Scotland moved into the 18th century, the state became more secular. The Kirk's power waned. The urgent need to prove Scotland's godliness, to root out every hint of devil worship, to avoid God's collective punishment, lost its force. Peace and relative prosperity also helped. When people are less desperate, when harvests are reliable and plague is absent, the need for scapegoats diminishes. The last execution in the Central Court records occurred in 1706. After that, while accusations continued, convictions became rare. Janet Horne's execution in 1727 was an aberration, a throwback to earlier fears in a remote region slow to change. Even at the time, its legality was questionable. In 1736, the unified British Parliament repealed both the Scottish Witchcraft Act of 1563 and the paralleled English Act. Witchcraft as a crime ceased to exist. No longer could someone be prosecuted for making a pact with the devil, for attending Sabbaths, for working harmful magic. The age of witch trials was over. Of the 3,212 people we know were accused, approximately 2/3 were executed. That is roughly 2,500 lives. 2,500 people strangled and burned, their bodies reduced to ash. But the true number is certainly higher. Many records have been lost. Local trials often went undocumented. The full scope of Scotland's witch trials will never be completely known. Behind each of those numbers was a person, a woman who knew how to ease the pain of childbirth, a grandmother who grew herbs in her garden, a widow trying to survive alone, a man who could read the weather, a healer who offered comfort when doctors had none to give. They were not consorting with devils. They were not flying to Sabbaths or transforming into hares. They were people, ordinary people, trying to live their lives in extraordinary times. The fire has burned low. Outside, the night is deep and still. We have walked a hard road tonight, through fear and pain and the darkest chapters of Scotland's history. Now, as we near the end of our journey, let us speak of memory and healing. On International Women's Day, March the 8th, 2022, Scotland's First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, stood before Parliament and issued a formal apology. She called the witch trials injustice on a colossal scale, acknowledged that the vast majority of those accused were women, and recognised that they were victims of misogyny, prejudice, and fear. The Church of Scotland followed with its own acknowledgement, expressing deep regret for the Kirk's role in the persecutions. These apologies cannot undo the past. They cannot bring back the dead or erase the suffering, but they can ensure that Scotland remembers that these women and men are finally recognised as victims rather than villains, as neighbours rather than monsters. A campaign led by Claire Mitchell KC and Zoe Venditozzi has worked tirelessly to honour the accused. They produced a podcast, created memorials, pushed for official recognition. Their work has helped shift the conversation, turning witch trials from folklore into history, from scary stories into human tragedy. The Survey of Scottish Witchcraft, a project at the University of Edinburgh, led by Professor Julian Goodyear, has mapped and documented every case they could find. Over 3,000 named individuals, their residences, their fates as far as records reveal. The interactive map allows anyone to see where the trials took place, to understand the geographic spread of persecution. Small memorials dot Scotland now, the Witch's Stone at Dornoch, marking where Janet Horne died, the horseshoe embedded at Maxwelton Cross in Paisley, commemorating the 7 burned there, individual plaques and markers at various locations, each one saying, "Here, someone accused died. Here, someone suffered." remember them. These are not grand monuments, they are quiet stones, humble markers, but they serve their purpose. They ensure that when we walk these streets and visit these towns, we remember what happened. Geillis Duncan, the young servant with a gift for healing. Agnes Sampson, the wise wife of Keith, healer and midwife. John Fian, the schoolmaster. Isobel Gowdie, who spoke in charms and fairy tales. Catherine Campbell, who cursed in anger and died for it. Lilias Adie, who refused to name others and sleeps by the sea. Janet Horne, confused and gentle by the bonny fire. And thousands more whose names we will never know, whose stories are lost, who deserve to be remembered just as much. The peat fire glows with its last embers, casting a gentle amber light across the room. Outside, the wind has gentled, and the night waits patient and still. We have travelled far tonight, through centuries of fear and flame, through trials and torture, through the breaking of spirits and the ending of lives. We have met the accused in their suffering, heard their names, witnessed their final moments. These were not tales of monsters and magic. These were stories of people, ordinary people, caught in the machinery of fear, grounded down by suspicion and misogyny and the desperate need to explain the unexplainable. Scotland's witch trials remind us how quickly communities can turn on their vulnerable members, how easily fear becomes cruelty, how suspicion spreads like plague, consuming the innocent along with the guilty, until there are only victims left. But they also show us something else. They show us how memory can heal, how acknowledgement matters, how speaking the truth about the past can help close old wounds. Scotland faced its history, looked at the darkness and said, "This was wrong. We are sorry. We remember." As you settle into sleep tonight, carry these lessons with you. Question accusations made in fear. Protect the vulnerable. Remember that those who appear different are often simply people we have not bothered to understand. And remember the women and men who died in Scotland's witch trials. They deserve our memory. They deserve our sorrow. They deserve to be known not as witches, but as what they truly were: victims of tragedy, neighbours who were failed, human beings who deserved better. The fire sighs its last breath, the night keeps watch, and somewhere in the darkness the wind carries their names. Sleep well, remember them, and keep the light burning. If you found this journey meaningful, please like and subscribe to Caledonia Sleeps. There are more stories waiting to be told, more histories to be honoured, more quiet nights by the fire ahead. Good night from the fireside. Good night from the Highlands. Good night.